Hello, podcasters. You're here because you want to start a podcast either for yourself or for your students. So let's just go over a few of the types in this video. To start off, let's talk about what a podcast is anyway. To start on the very basics, a podcast is a series of spoken word or audio episodes all focused on a particular topic or theme. So it's more than just one episode. So you want to think about how are you going to string together a series of episodes on a theme. All right. Let's go over some of the podcast formats. We're going to go over 4 of them in this first video. The types I would like to go over are interview style, a solo or monologue, conversational or co-hosted, and lastly, panel discussion. These are grouped together because they take a little bit less planning and editing on the back end, and a little bit less production and easier to pull off. So first up, the interview format. This is where a host or two interviews a new guest in each episode. This is really the most common format for podcasts for the simple reason that it's easy to do. Benefits or the pros are the guests do the talking in this scenario. So the interviewer doesn't need to say too much. It just needs to guide the conversation. And there's a variety of viewpoints and opinions as different guests come on the podcast. Now, the cons to this is interviewing is more than just coming up with a list of questions and going through the list. You really have to have deep listening and responding to the interviewee, and that takes a bit of practice. And in order to do that and have a successful podcast, you really need to research your guests, so you're understanding where they're coming from. Here's a few examples of an interview podcast. Innovated, which is Carly Parsons and Sandy Miller, is an education podcast on Voice Ed Radio. Ty Asks Why is a student podcast or a child podcast. Ty is hosted by the CBC. And How I Built This by Guy Raz is where Guy Raz interviews CEOs and entrepreneurs about how they started their business. Next up is solo monologue podcasts. This is a really simple setup. You just talk into the microphone. It's just one person, but it's harder than you think because you have to carry the whole episode. The benefits are you don't have to rely on anyone else, and editing is much easier because you only have one audio track to edit. So it's really easy to cut out your mistakes and your ums and be done with it. On the downside, it's a lot of talking. To fill an episode with just you talking can be a challenge. Here's some examples of a solo and monologue podcast for you to check out. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History is a really good one. We've got The Memory Palace by Nate DeMeo, really beautiful podcast with interesting, tender moments in history. And Teaching Little Brains, our very own shift coach, Sarah Nicaruk, talking about various topics on brain science and neuroscience and neuropsychology. Next up, conversational, co-hosted podcast. This might be a popular one too because it's just 2 people having a straightforward conversation together. All right, both people are hosts. There isn't a guest. It's just a back and forth between 2 people. The pros of this one is it's really a relaxed, organic kind of conversation that's fun to listen to. Now, the downsides are because it relies on conversation, it can't really be scripted in that regard. So it's got to rely more on both people knowing what they're talking about and not really reading from a text. Here's some good examples of this one. Office Ladies is super fun. Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey about dissecting episodes of The Office, if you're an Office fan. The Gals podcast, the other shift coach, Rachel Johnson, hosts this with Katie Atwell, and it's a great conversation about ed tech on each episode. And last is Tumble Podcast, is a science podcast for kids that is co-hosted as well. Last is the panel discussion. It's like the interview, but with more people, all right, with a panel of people. The benefits of this are it's a lot less pressure on the host because there's so many people talking that the host doesn't actually say that much. And the other benefit is if you have multiple guests, you have multiple takes or perspectives on the topic. Now, the downside is logistics. Filling the panel with a bunch of guests and coordinating schedules can be a lot of work on the back end. And it does, just like interviewing takes skill, it will take skill to keep the flow going in this format as well, making sure that everyone has equal talk time and people aren't dominating the floor, and knowing how to kind of cut off a participant if they're talking too long and things like that. here's some examples of a panel podcast. This is a good one about parenting. Mom and dad are fighting. It's a panel podcast from Slate. Colson Radio, students at the Irma Colson Public School did one, and it's a group of students, and they talk about what it takes to be a hero and celebrations and whatnot. And this is a good example of a student-led podcast. And another Slate one, Political Gabfest, is a panel discussion about politics, as the name would say. And that's it for the first part. And the second part, the second video, we're going to be talking about 3 more that involve a little bit more editing. So stay tuned for that one.